Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the Libertarian Angle on the burning issues of the day. I'm joined, as I am by every week, by Richard Ebeling, the BB&T Distinguished Professor in Ethics and Free Enterprise Leadership at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you, Jacob, and our viewers and listeners who have kindly joined us.
Yeah, for anyone who would like additional information on the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at fff.org. Richard, you have been posting a very interesting series of short pieces on your Facebook page regarding your top 10 favorite books of all time. Libertarian books, I presume, and you've posted the 4 of those, and those were very interesting. And so I thought, we ought to discuss these books that people sometimes ask, what can I do to learn more about libertarianism? And books have certainly played a strong role in your intellectual development, my intellectual development. So I found your series very interesting, and I thought we would go ahead and discuss these. And also, we're going to be posting your series that you're doing on Facebook on FFF's website, as well as in our FFF Daily, our daily newsletter that people can get for free by subscribing. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how this came about, and then we'll go into your episode 1.
Okay. Well, if anyone has a Facebook account, and I've heard that there's a few people around the world, a number of people, I don't know how it started, sort of like a chain letter. Some people had started like posting, please name the top 10 books that had influenced you. And one of the people who had done this is the great classical liberal libertarian historian Robert Higgs, who I've known for years, Bob Higgs. And he finished his, and then he sent me a Facebook message saying, well, Richard, why don't you take a turn at this? So a few days ago, I began doing this. You're supposedly to try to do it once a day for 10 days. And I decided to do this on the basis of sort of like a chronology of influences on me. So my first one was, in fact, Ayn Rand's collection of nonfiction essays, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, which originally appeared in 1966. Why that book? Well, that's basically the book who got me into free market, individualist, libertarian, classical liberal oriented ideas. I had always been interested in politics, current events in high school, and I was a teenager at that time. But I was sort of confused about things. I had a part-time job after my high school hours at the Hollywood Public Library. I lived in Hollywood, California at that time when I was a teenager. And my job was to take care of the magazine collection, which was on a balcony. It was a delightful old Art Deco building, which unfortunately had burned down much years later. And, new issues come in, they have to be shelved. Issues are asked for, you reshelve them. And I was able to finish my work in about 2 hours. And I would just basically, if I can put it this way, hide on the balcony reading magazines. And I was reading both conservative and liberal in the modern American sense. So National Review and what is it? A couple of others like Modern Age, Human Events Magazine or newsletter. And then on the left, The Nation, The New Republic. And I was very confused. And I was very confused because on the one hand, those on the left would say, don't you care about fairness? Don't you care about justice? Don't you care about your fellow man? And my heart would, feel sad. And then I would read the conservative literature, like the Human Events, National Review, and they would always say, yeah, but it costs a lot, and there's a bottom line, and besides, those commies seem to kill a lot of people. Get your head on straight. And so my head said, oh no, my heart would say, oh yes. I was so confused, Jacob. Anyway, so to make a long story short, I met two guys that had a counter in a restaurant, cafeteria style counter in a restaurant, and they introduced me to the writings of Ayn Rand. And the first book that they asked me or recommended for me to read was her Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. If I can take a minute, Jacob, I'll tell the story. So I sit down at this counter, and these two guys who are sitting next to me start talking to me. And I had been at a used bookstore along Hollywood Boulevard and was looking through the books that I had bought. And they asked me, what about this? And what are you reading? Why is it interesting? And one of them finally said to me, did you ever hear of Ayn Rand? And I said, well, I've heard of the Rand Corporation. What's an Ayn? And they said, well, this is a writer. She deals with these profound ideas concerning freedom and tyranny. And one of them whips out this copy of Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. And he said, they both say, we want you to read this and come back here in 3 days. And this is, Jacob, a true story. And so I go home and I absorb these essays. What is capitalism? The Gold Standard by Alan Greenspan. Her essay on the roots of war. I'm all turned on about this. And so I come back in 3 days and I hand back the book. We talk about it, and then the other guy whips out a paperback copy of her earlier collection, The Virtue of Selfishness, and he says, we want you to read this and come back in 3 days. So this is a true story. And so I go, this is great. This is a wonderful philosophy. I absorb these essays. Now, this is a philosophy of freedom, and I don't have to feel guilty anymore. If there's a bum lying in the gutter, he doesn't have a claim on my life, and he probably belongs there. Hallelujah, this is the philosophy. So I go back in 3 days, and I hand back the book, and we talk more. And he said, you noticed her references in those two books. She also wrote novels. I said, yeah, I noticed that. And one of them whips out a paperback copy of Atlas Shrugged. I'm dying now. I'm fearful. This is like a 900-page book, a 1,000-page book. I just know they're going to say, come back in 3 days. My heart is sinking. They hand me the book and they say, we want you to read this and come back in 10 days. I wiped the sweat from my brow. So I went home and I absorbed that. I read John Gall's speech like at least twice, maybe 3 times. And I come back and we talk about this and they recommend the Fountainhead. And then they say, there are lectures about her philosophy that you could attend right here in Hollywood. I go, what lectures? Because this was during the time when there was still in existence the old Nathaniel Branden Institute. And they had affiliates around the country, students of objectivism. And you could go, take lectures by her, by Nathaniel Branden, by others. So they started, inviting me to go with them. And they would have a break, coffee break, bathroom break. And there was this collection of books you could buy, recommended by Ayn Rand. So what was there? Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, Herbert Spencer's Man versus the State, Isabel Patton's The God of the Machine, and so on and so on.
Who was inviting you to these parties?
These two guys.
Oh, same guys. Okay.
Same two guys. Okay, one was a house painter, just like painting rooms. The other one was a substitute school teacher. I even still remember his name. His name was Louis Politis. And he was a substitute school teacher in the Los Angeles public school system. Now, what does a substitute teacher do? The regular teacher is out sick for a few days. They basically babysit the class. So he was an objectivist, and he viewed himself, if I can use this phrase, on a mission from God. And that was to go in and take, and he's in this class for 2 days, that class 1 day, to be a missionary for Ayn Rand's objectivism with these high school kids. That was his mission in life. And these two guys would hang out in this restaurant. It was called Hodie's Restaurant at the corner of Hollywood and Vine. It's long gone. And they would sit at the stools at the counter and leave a stool empty between them, like the spider attracting an intellectual fly. And I was the fly that day. And this is a true story. Anyway, so at these taped lecture sessions, which was in a business building at the corner of Hollywood and Highland Boulevard, you could buy these books. Mises's Socialism, Bureaucracy. And that's how I found out about all of these economics books, because having read particularly Capitalism, An Unknown Ideal, in some of the essays, they had footnote references to Mises and Hazlitt, so I wanted to read them, and there were these books that you could buy. And that's how I got turned on to all of this. So in that sense, my first entree into a philosophy of political and economic individualism, to an appreciation of both the workings and the ethics of a free market system. And that in reality, some people waste their lives, but a lot of people are lying in the gutter, not of their own making, but because of government policies that have blocked opportunities for them to have a reasonable life. And as a consequence, that got me on the road for this. And so in a sense, Jerome Tucili, a fellow who wrote a book, again, back in the 1970s, I guess, called It Usually Begins with Ayn Rand. Well, that was me. That was the generation I belonged to, Jacob. The generation for whom it began with Ayn Rand.
Explain a little bit about, for people who are not aware, what the Nathaniel Branden Institute was about and how that related to Ayn Rand.
Okay. The short version, for those who may be not too familiar, Ayn Rand was born in Russia in 1905. Her father, if I remember correctly, had a pharmacy. He was a pharmacist. It was expropriated by the communists after the Bolshevik Revolution. She attended the University of Petrograd in the early 1920s as a young girl, getting a degree in philosophy. But she came to loathe and hate the system. And so she had the opportunity, when things were lightened up a little bit in a period called the New Economic Policy, which Lenin had instituted, for her to use the connections of some relatives in Chicago to get out of the country. And she stayed, and she gravitated to Hollywood. She started working in wardrobe, eventually helping to write scripts. And in that setting, she began to write her own novels. The first one was called We the Living, which actually, in terms of the humanness of the characters, in my opinion, is her best.
Hey, Richard, we're getting some background interference here.
That's because there's construction site next to my house.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm just going to continue then.
All right.
That's so the listeners know what that is. Anyway, so it's a novel basically about young people in the new communist Russia who are college students. And the main character is a girl named Kira. She has a lover who's destroyed by the system. And it's basically a fictionalized version of her horrifying experiences as a young person in the first communist state. And then she wrote a great little book, a novelette, if you will, called Anthem, a futuristic novel. And then her big claim was that in 1943 she published her first major novel, The Fountainhead, about an individualist architect who less creative people in the society attempt to destroy. And then finally in 1956, she published, 57, excuse me, she published her greatest novel, Atlas Shrugged. But anyway, after The Fountainhead had come out, she got a fan letter from a Canadian student, a young man named Nathaniel Branden. And he ended up going to LA for college, or I guess for college. And he started meeting her, and they became close. In fact, even though there was an over 20-year difference, he went to New York to do graduate studies. She and her husband, Frank O'Connor, then moved to New York also, and they ended up in an affair, even with a 20-year difference between them. And after Atlas Shrugged came out, and he becoming sort of the main expositor of her philosophy, she basically gave her name, and I assume seed money, to set up the Nathaniel Branden Institute. And it existed until 1968, when they had a great falling out for reasons that need not be gone into, about which there's plenty of literature for the interested person. So the Nathaniel Branden Institute ceased existence in the summer, I guess it was, of 1968. Now, fortuitous for me, if I can sort of go back to my own experiences, is that I guess it was during the Christmas break or early January or something, and I was still just finishing up my last year of high school. I went back to New York to visit my grandmother, and so I'm already high on her philosophy. So I went to several events at the Nathaniel Branden Institute, and in one of them, Jacob, I actually had an opportunity to meet Ayn Rand. It was a social evening, and she very graciously spent maybe half an hour, maybe 40 minutes, talking to a group of us, small group of maybe 6 or 8 people, answering our questions, discussing some of her ideas. And a lot of people have described her as someone who would look you straight in the eye, not only when she was listening to you, but when she was talking to you. She had a penetrating dark eyes, as if she's looking in your soul. And it is true. She looked right at you. She didn't waver. And she was charming. She was delightful and intellectually unbelievably rigorous, like a bolt of lightning right through the clouds of ideas. That evening, she was dressed in a red denim railwayman's outfit with like a conductor's cap. Her husband, Frank O'Connor, was dressed in, the older people will know what I mean by this, a Nehru suit with beads. This was the 60s. And as a social, they even had dancing. And so she and Frank were sort of light on their feet on the dance floor. There was also a part of the Nathaniel Branden Institute which was sort of like a game room. And so, of course, there were people there playing what game? Monopoly. So, so it was interesting. But that was my opportunity to have a chance to meet with and briefly interact with Ayn Rand, a truly an amazing person. She's obviously controversial. Conservatives often don't like her because her defense of selfishness as enlightened or rational self-interest. They often dislike her because of her strongly atheist and anti-religious views. Some libertarians dislike her for other reasons. But in fairness, besides her own intellectual contribution, in fairness, it is doubtful whether there would have been the renaissance and the development of a classical liberal / libertarian revival in the post-World War II period, certainly from the 50s and into 60s into the 70s, if there had not been Ayn Rand. Her novels, and precisely because it was in that novel form, reached an immense audience of hundreds of thousands, millions of readers, which then attracted them to read books which they otherwise might not have, nonfiction essays on boring economics and politics. So it's not that she was the only major figure bringing about this revival, but in fairness, as an historical fact, she was a major force in bringing about the reawakening of the individualist philosophy after the New Deal years of Franklin Roosevelt and the rise in the appeal of socialism and communism in the East Bloc countries.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you choose Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal is the #1 book. I mean, I might put Rand at the top of my list. Also competing for that would be Leonard Read's books, the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education, who had a powerful impact on me. But the Rand book that I would put at the top for me would be Atlas Shrugged. And I'll detail you my experience learning about Rand. That when I was in high school, a really good friend of mine, a girl, said to me, "Hey, I've got a great book I want to recommend you. You need to read this book." And I said, "Yeah, what is it?" And she says, "It's a book called Atlas Shrugged." And I just kind of shrugged, so to speak, and said, maybe. And I didn't pursue it. I mean, that's how close I came to discovering libertarianism in high school. And she never brought it up again, so I passed up that opportunity. And then later, several years later, I was in law school, and I had to drop out for 3 months to go to infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia, because I was in the Army Reserves. And so I had 2 months free time between like October to the spring semester starting in January. So I started waiting tables at a restaurant in Dallas. I was going to law school at the University of Texas. Well, I had my afternoons free because we served lunches and then dinners, so I would come home in the afternoons and just watch television. And there was a channel there that showed an afternoon movie called Bowling for Dollars or something like this, where they would feature this afternoon movie. So I started watching, and it was the movie version of The Fountainhead with Patricia Neal and Gary Cooper. So I was transfixed. I mean, I was just mesmerized by this movie. And so it finishes, and it had such a powerful impact on me. And at the end of the movie, it says this is based on the novel by Ayn Rand. So I immediately go to a bookstore and buy The Fountainhead. And I just read it from cover to cover, can't put it down, absolutely loved it. But it never occurs to me to go look for other things by Ayn Rand. I just, okay, I love this book, I love this movie, and for me it was sort of a standalone. So I ended up finishing law school, and I returned home to my hometown of Laredo, Texas. And a friend recommends a book to me called A Time for Truth by William Simon. And so I read through this book, and I came back to him. And now remember, I'm an ardent socialist at this point, Democrat, believe the state should be taking care of people and so forth. I mean, I had been ingrained with it. You talk about brainwashed, And so I said to my friend, well, I enjoyed the book, but I mean, what's all this stuff about Americans are not free? Simon's a little bit kind of strange saying that. I mean, Americans are free. What's he talking about? It just did not register, but it planted seeds clearly, because then I discover shortly thereafter the series of books that the Foundation for Economic Education had published. I discovered them while rummaging around the local public library, and the books were called Essays on Liberty, which it had a profound effect on me, and they were just these uncompromising essays. I mean, that's why here at FFF we advocate this uncompromising presentation of libertarianism, because that had such a powerful effect on me that I figured, hey, it can have a powerful effect on other people as well. This is how I discovered Leonard Read and Ludwig von Mises and Hayek and Bastiat. And then in the midst of this, doing research and all these people that I was discovering within these books, I discover Rand and I discover Atlas Shrugged. And so it was at that point that I read Atlas Shrugged, and it just had this powerful effect on me. In fact, it still does. I think I've read Atlas Shrugged 3 times. So I think it was 1979 that the National Committee on Monetary Reform, an organization that promoted gold and the gold standard, was having this annual conference in New Orleans. Now, this was a huge event. I mean, like a few thousand people. This was when gold was in its heyday in the late 70s. And so you had panels with Austrians and Austrian investment people. And the keynote speaker is Ayn Rand. So I was there, and it was the last speech that Rand gave before she died. And she was obviously ill at the time. But yeah, I'm able to say I saw Ayn Rand give her last public speech. So yeah, it's a remarkable impact that this woman has had with her books on so many people, and I'm one of them.
Yeah, it's a strange phenomenon that she should come along and choose to follow this path of literature, because obviously you reach far more people through a literary format, a novel, than nonfiction work. I mean, there have been outstanding and bestseller nonfiction works. They're there all the time, for example, on the New York Times bestseller list. But the fictional format enabled her to tell a story. Now, again, her novels have been controversial. Are her characters real, or are they too one-dimensional? But art has, among its functions, to sort of capture essential attributes, qualities, and characteristics of things in the world. And sometimes to highlight them, there's degrees of exaggeration. Caricature, if you will, but not in the pejorative sense that you sometimes can use that word. What is a man or a woman of integrity, character? What does it mean to stand for principle? what does it mean to be a coward, or someone who tries to take credit for others' achievements? What does it mean to be a power luster, someone who's corrupt, a plunderer? And so what she attempts to do is to look at these qualities, conceptual qualities, and put them characters, especially in Atlas Shrugged, to highlight the essence of what these characteristics of good or evil really represent. And in that sense, that those degrees of caricature exaggerations, in fact, clarify different concepts, ideas, and relationships within a person and between people and social systems. And in that in itself makes her way, her venue, if you will, profoundly successful. And if you understand that, you can perhaps be more tolerant or appreciative or less critical of some aspects that some people don't like in her literary style.
Yeah, I agree with you, and it was that principled approach, especially in Atlas Shrugged, that I found so attractive. I mean, here she really is giving the immorality of the socialist concept and the welfare state concept, and the way she presented it in this principled, uncompromising way, I found so very attractive. And when she talks about the bureaucrats in this. The slimy bureaucrat Dr. Ferris, who I forget who he's talking to. He's talking to Reardon, Hank Reardon, where he says, "Look, you have to understand that we have all these laws because we want people to be breaking the law. When people break the law, they start feeling guilty, and we can come after them. And so that's the advantage of our system of this regulated economy." And then she talked about the immorality of taking money from one group of people and give it to another group of people with the moocher society. And I found that presentation that didn't call for reform or phasing out things, but talked about the immorality of the system. I found it enormously satisfying, and part of the reason why I became a libertarian. Yeah, now, let me say, I never was attracted to the philosophy of objectivism. I read her nonfiction works. I'm a Christian, so I wasn't attracted to her atheism. But in terms of her principled approach in Atlas Shrugged, I absolutely loved it.
Yeah, you see, the thing that comes out as well in this is this idea of an enlightened philosophy of self-interest, that you shouldn't be considered the slave of another. You shouldn't view yourself as somehow an amorphous element in a collective. It doesn't mean that you are you're an island to yourself, but that each individual, as reflected in the concepts of the Declaration of Independence, has an inalienable right to his life, his liberty, his pursuit of happiness. That means, rightly understood, as she would argue, you have a right to live for yourself. It doesn't mean you don't care about family, friends, the wider society in which you live. But that no one has a right to speak in terms of the amorphous and ambiguous collective, to say that they have a claim on your life. And one other thing about the characters portrayed in Atlas Shrugged, Jacob, is that you see she's often portrayed as an apologist for capitalism. That is, anything that goes on in our society today that is involving, quote, private enterprise. She makes it very clear in the characters drawn in Atlas Shrugged that there are the moral and ethical men of enterprise. They have their own ideas, their own innovative risk-taking, their own vision, and they wish to only associate with people on the basis of free, mutual agreed upon voluntary exchange. And then there are those moochers, those who wish to use the government for favors, privileges, subsidies, protections, prohibitions, to gain that which they can not honestly acquire through peaceful voluntary exchange in open competition with others. In other words, what a good part of her villains in Atlas Shrugged are exemplifying what has come to be covered by the term crony capitalism. That is, the corrupted system of private enterprisers using the state for wealth and market share and profits, and not free enterprisers who operate in the world of Adam Smith of free and voluntary exchange, in which, as if guided by an invisible hand, the only way you can advance your own self-interest is by serving others, because to get what they have, you must give them something in exchange that they desire enough to part with what they have that you want.
Yeah, what's your take on the waning moments here of the program? What's your take on her concept of altruism? That, you know, when I read this and her book, The Virtue of Selfishness, you know, you almost get the impression that she is not taking into consideration the value of private charity, where people really want to help out others. And that seemed to me a drawback to her work, that she didn't emphasize that this is the part of the freedom of individuals, is that if you do see a person in need, you should be free to take care of that person with your own money. I think that sometimes gets lost in her concept of the virtue of selfishness and her condemnation of altruism. What do you think about that?
I think you're right. You see, the thing is, I would express it this way. If you read her essays carefully, or the arguments of her characters in Atlas Shrugged, she never challenges, questions, or denies the ethics of charity and philanthropy. But she believes that the individual certainly has the liberty in a free society to be generous, or to use her word, benevolent, for those who they think is deserving of a helping hand, assistance, support, may have fallen upon hard times not of their own making. So if you read her carefully, she is not against charity, philanthropy, concern for those whom have value to you. What she's revolting against, and understandably, is that this idea, well, don't you care about your fellow man? Don't you care about your family members? Don't you care about your friends? Don't you care about those who are your neighbors in your community? You surely don't view yourself as Robinson Crusoe on an island without human contact, do you? Who then use that, Jacob, to say, well, surely if you care about others, then isn't it legitimate to sort of like, through a pooling of everybody's concern for the other members of the society, isn't it reasonable then, Jacob, to use that agency that has the means to draw resources from all of us and disperse it on behalf of all of us, the state, to do these good works? And her justifiable opposition and ethical criticisms of compulsory philanthropy, compulsory charity, forced good giving to others, made her, given the way she decided to construct her philosophy, made her create an impression that she was against the concepts of voluntary giving and charity and philanthropy and concern for others. People who've written biographies of her, or people who knew her well, say that, in fact, she always did it quietly, which is if I can say this, a properly understood Christian principle, that you're not being boastful about your good works. According to people and biographies, there were people who she helped through college, she gave financial support to, that she viewed as people deserving and worthy of having a chance when their own circumstances were limiting that. So in fact, she practiced those things, but her resistance against the coarse collectivization of it made her use phrases that sort of hid beneath the surface her own sympathy and considered legitimacy of such a benevolent caring for others.
Okay, on that note, we're out of time, but if you'd like to know more about Richard's top 10 favorite book list, we're going to be posting it this week on our website at fff.org and in our FFF Daily. If you're not currently subscribing, you can subscribe for free. We won't be doing Libertarian Angle next week. Richard, why don't you tell us what you're going to be doing next week?
Well, I am a member of the Mont Pelerin Society. This is a nonprofit organization of scholars, businessmen, interested and informed citizens, originated and founded by Friedrich Hayek back, in 1947. It is still going alive and well. They have annual meetings, and I will be presenting a paper at one of the sessions, a session devoted to Mises and Hayek. And the meeting this year, this coming week, next week, is in the Canary Islands, Spanish territory off the coast of Morocco. So it looks like I'll be missing next week, and I apologize to our viewers and listeners, but as Douglas MacArthur once said famously, I shall return.
Oh, God. All right. On that note, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all very much for tuning in. Richard, enjoyed the conversation, and we'll look forward to talking to you the week after next.
Take care.